Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. The commander we're tackling this week has definitely captured a lot of people's hearts. And their spells. Ivy Gleeful Spellthief sports a very new and exciting ability in Simic colors. 2 mana, 2/1 flying, and whenever anyone casts a spell that targets only one other creature, we can also copy that spell to target Ivy too, if we so choose. Ivy already has over 1,100 decks to her name on EDHREC, and it's safe to say that she's activated a lot of players' imaginations. Her page reveals a smattering of different auras and spells to copy, but the most important detail here is definitely the high number of mutate creatures. To properly dive into her strategy, let's get right to it and snag her average deck list from the average deck feature and import it to the Archidect deck building website. As always in this series, any swaps we make must either keep the total price of the deck cost neutral, or else help lower the overall cost of the deck. While we're taking a brief scroll through the deck list, I wanted to do a quick reminder that Ivy's ability is optional. If an opponent uses a single target removal spell on another creature, we don't have to copy that for Ivy. I know it sounds obvious, but I've seen a lot of discussion online where folks seem to forget that this is a May ability. In addition to that, here's an even more important reminder. Ivy's ability copies the spells from the stack, and copies of permanent spells will become tokens, but this is not the same thing as creating a token. So don't rush out to get like a Parallel Lives or an Adrix and Nev Twincasters or anything else that doubles your token creation for this deck, because they won't work with the commander. Those token doublers aren't popular enough in Ivy decks that they appear in this average deck list, so we won't have to worry about them for this video, but according to the data so far, nearly a fifth of Ivy players brewing up their lists are currently including cards like Parallel Lives, which wouldn't work with the commander. And since there are already 1,100 Ivy decks registered on EDHREC, this just seems like prudent advice to give out right as we're getting started. Okay, with that done, let's briefly examine Ivy's signature cards and playstyle. First, the creatures. We need a good chunk of these to target with our spells so that we can get the double benefit of copying things with our commander. Stuff like the Oof or heroic creatures that get extra benefits when we target them are especially key here. Then we have the spells themselves, which come in 3 different forms. First, the instants and sorceries. These tend to take the form of single target cantrip effects, which when copied will allow us to pay 1 mana to draw 2 cards. We can even target enemy creatures with these if all we have in play is just our commander. These small spells are a hugely important aspect to the deck, and they also usually help fulfill a protective role too, keeping 2 creatures safe at the same time. Then there are the auras. These are the primary buff effects to help amplify our creatures, and they come in a wide range of forms that look really exciting to copy. It's also important to note that a bunch of these auras will serve protective functions as well, to help our creatures survive and thrive. 2 Rankers, 2 Umbras, 2 creatures getting hexproof, we can really make some awesome stompy stuff happen here. We even have a few constellation effects in the deck too, because when the auras are copied, those copies enter the battlefield from the stack as enchantment tokens, and that will draw us extra cards for more enchantment fall. Plus, these creatures are really good targets to wear the buffs in the first place too. But then, finally, we have one of the most important and confusing categories in the deck, the mutate cards. So mutate is a complicated ability, but these are creature spells that target one of our own creatures, and that triggers Ivy, so we'll get double mutation going on. And if you've ever played against a mutate deck, you already know that these can get really out of hand with tons upon tons of triggered effects. However, in our deck, the mutations serve an additional purpose. When we mutate onto Ivy, we can put the creature on top of the pile, and that removes Ivy's legendary status. So if you wanted, you can then start copying Ivy. In fact, a whole bunch of extra cards in the deck are here for exactly that purpose, making additional copies of Ivy so that we can copy our mutations and our auras and our instants like 3 times or 4 times or more. Copy effects like Twinning Staff and the Duplimancy can make this deck go just out of control. But we'll dive more into the copying and mutate shenanigans in just a bit. For now, let's get going. This video has 2 simple parts. First, just a small number of swaps to the average list as it is, and then we'll make the deck even more budget-friendly. Let's hop to it. I really don't have that many swaps to make to this list. Like, if I were building Ivy just for myself, since I don't personally have an Enchantress deck yet, I would be very tempted, I think, to build an Aura Voltron type of deck with her. But that's just my taste in tea. And the reality is that Ivy is extremely diverse. She can go in a bunch of different directions. We see auras, but we also see mutate, and we also see a bunch of spells and things like that. And Normally, I would worry that when you see that many different types of things represented in an average deck, that might be a sign that the commander is trying to do too much at once. Too many cooks in the kitchen, the attention is split, and it just makes the deck stumble a little bit because they're not fully committed to any single one of those strategies. But that's not the case here, and that's why I don't have that many swaps to make. This average deck list does have a lot of different things going on, but I think it's actually just really dang good at showing off all of her capabilities and showing off all of her strengths. The first thing I'll highlight is the land count in this deck, which is super low, just 33 lands, but I'm not going to touch that number. Our commander is just 2 mana, and a great many cards in our deck are just 1 mana. We have like 2 total cards that will cast for 5 mana or more, and even the majority of our mutators attach for 4 mana or less. This deck is extraordinarily low to the ground, and that will inform a lot of the cuts we make here. Just to be sure that I've justified this point, I'll note that this deck's average mana curve is 2.54. As a point of comparison, in the last video I did, Joda's average mana curve was 3.3. Going one more step, I did a Lathril video a long while back, and elves are notorious for only running like 33 lands in their decks, and that deck's average mana curve was 2.96. Ivy's got a really low curve here, and we do not want this deck to flood out with too many lands. So, to get on to the cuts, this is actually why I'm going to switch some of our ramp around. For instance, there's a lone Cultivate here, but no Kodama's Reach that would usually go with it. In almost every other circumstance, I would want both, but here I'm actually going to take out the Cultivate. Before I say what I'm swapping in for it, I'll actually take a brief detour over to the artifacts and note that I'm also exchanging this here Simic Signet out of the deck too. Both are really good cards, but in this deck we can be more clever with our ramp. So, out they go, and what I'd like to do is theme our ramp around our commander's abilities. We have a few mana dorks in the deck already, Sanctum Weaver is especially a highlight, and this is very instructive for us. We want low mana costs that, in a pinch, can serve as the extra body that Ivy needs to get copying. So I'm adding in these 3 creatures to the deck to help flesh this out. Ivy can really suffer if we don't have an extra body to start copying things and drawing extra cards, and each of these creatures could serve that function. Granted, Sakura usually blows itself up, but I don't know, this deck has a rampant growth already, so why not the creature version too? There's a chance that these creatures could help us out occasionally, and they suit our mana curve and our strategy more than the ramp spells that we cut. Alright, speaking of the if we're playing one, why not both conundrum, a short tour of our instant spells reveals a similar situation. We have a Pongify here, but not a Rapid Hybridization. I think we should have both. We have a lot of interactive spells in this deck, but I especially like these 2 as a way to rid the world of any flying blockers that would get in our way, and our commander won't care about the thing that replaces them. 1 mana removal is just so dang good. Okay, now we have to get to the cutting of cards, which is always the hard part. There are a lot of other targeting spells that I would love to add to this deck, but after spending a lot of time on it, I'm convinced that there's not actually a lot of room here. Our copyable cantrip spells, for example, can't usually afford to be more than 1 mana, not when we're dealing with cantrips and auras and mutate cards all on the same deck. There's just not room. Instead, after poring over this deck for so long, I find myself a little bit more bugged by mana costs, specifically this Gnarlback Rhino. I love the effect, but we have several other creatures of this type already, and they're like 2 or 3 mana. 4 mana is like the top of the curve in this deck, so we don't want to have to wait for turn 4 to finally play out the things that will get our strategy started in the first place. This card just really felt like it underperformed for me. I have 2 final cuts to make, and these are going to look weird at first, but I promise I have a good reason. Let's talk about Mirror Box and Combat Research. Now, to be clear, Mirror Box is a super cool card. Like, I want to make a whole deck around this thing. Multiple legends in play? Awesome. And Combat Research is a nice little ditty that gives us extra rewards if the enchanted creature is legendary. The enchanted creature doesn't need to be legendary, but, still, it's cool. But here's my umbrage with these cards. Mutating Ivy makes her non-legendary. If we make copies of Ivy after she's not legendary, Mirror Box does nothing in that case. Mirror Box fulfills a function that 1/6 of the non-land cards in our deck already have covered, so I just find it redundant. Then there's Combat Research, and this one's harder to explain. Like, even if Ivy is not going to be legendary when this thing's on it, it's still a curiosity effect, right? Well, yeah, but even those only feel okay to me compared to the cantrips. And actually, specifically, curiosity is worded a little differently. Whenever the enchanted creature hits an opponent, you draw a card, versus giving the ability when I hit an opponent draw a card to the creature itself. In other words, if we don't have any other creatures of our own, we can actually safely put Curiosity onto an opponent's creature. And if that opponent's creature hits another of our opponents, we'll still be the ones who draw the card. If the enchantment gives the creature the ability itself, then the opponent will be the one who draws the card. So there's a small but potentially relevant difference there. I mean, this is all semantics, really. It's not like a big enough detail for this to be the thing that justifies cutting the card. It's just a small thing that I noticed that I thought was worth pointing out. Combat Research is an aura that can draw cards, but it has some very, very small non-bows with our strategy, where we occasionally will target enemy creatures to try and draw more cards, and where we constantly make our commander non-legendary. It occurs to me that I've spent the greatest amount of time explaining this cut, even though this is like the least important cut of the entire deck, but that's the irony of it all, isn't it? Explaining minute details that aren't really a big deal usually takes longer than explaining the obvious and most important stuff. Alright, Joe, enough waxing philosophical. Why are you making room for one final card to add to the deck? Well, because I want to be a little gremlin here. This deck is ripe for a corrupted conscience. Enchant an enemy creature, gain control of it, and give it infect, and we can enchant our own commander to give it infect too. Look, I'm no lover of infect or anything, but there's no way that's not the funniest thing ever. We get to turn Ivy into Poison Ivy. That's good and you know it. There's no way we're passing that up. Alright, those are the official swaps, but before we move on, I will shout out some very quick honorable mentions for higher budget Ivy players. There are some traditional cards that I expect will grab the attention of several Ivy players, like advanced protection spells or utility lands like Boseiju especially. But I also think these three cards are definitely worth investing in too. Sakashima helps us get more Ivies to spread the copies around. Multiple Eldrazi conscriptions will be so stinking ridiculous here. And Treachery is bonkers. It's just bonkers. Gain control of an enemy creature and untapping lands is already amazing, but a second copy means it will get an additional untap trigger and we can float mana in between them. Like, this steals a creature and gives us mana. That's amazing. Alright, here we have the first deck list. You can find a link to this version of the deck in the description below, but we're not done yet. We have one more super budget Spellthief section too. Building this deck on a slightly tighter budget is not complicated. This part's gonna go pretty quick. So I'm going to cut out just 8 cards from the deck, and that will basically cut the price of the deck in half. First, we'll lose just 2 lands and save $30. Swap in a simple dual-typed replacement and a basic, and boom, we're feeling good. Then we'll cut out these 6 most expensive cards from the deck, which will save us about another $50 on the list. While these are all very good cards, we are also very okay without them. And in their place, I'm going to make one sweeping addition. More copy spells. Remember how mutating Ivy makes her non-legendary? Well, once she's non-legendary, we can use one of these spells to make a copy of a creature we control, and that spell will also target Ivy, making a new version of her. And then, if we cast another of these copy spells, that will hit all of our non-legendary mutated Ivies, which makes even more copies of them. Then we cast a single cantrip, and we're drawing like 5 cards for 1 mana. So yeah, these are the 5 copy spells I'm throwing into the deck. Who cares about those expensive cards? We are having so much fun here. Although, fair warning, this deck is very finicky in this state, so be prepared to track a lot of information on the battlefield with all of these copies, all of these mutations, and all of these clones. Oh, and as for the last card that I'm adding in, well, when we have multiple copies of creatures that all happen to have the same name as each other, I just think it makes a lot of sense to play a Dastardly Echoing Courage. Target creature and each creature with the same name gets +2 for the turn. Copy that spell multiple times, and then suddenly they're each getting +6 or +10 for just 2 mana. That is what I call a finisher. Like I said, super quick. A small change in budget, but a fun change in strategy. A link to both versions of the decklist can be found down below with all the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you had a great time stealing spells with Ivy, and if you have any other recommendations that you'd like to make for your fellow spell thieves, make sure you leave your suggestions down in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.